Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Kupyansk, and in this one there are several developments across the front line, both in favor of the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Russians managed to advance across the Sherbets River line in the northern parts of the Russian bridgehead across the river line, while the Ukrainians managed to recapture some positions in the direction of Rydkuduk just south of that. The Russians managed to advance in the southern flank of Pokrovsk and in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, where they are storming the town of Kupyansk, while the Ukrainians managed to regain some positions north of that, as well as to the east of Kupyansk, defeating the Russian foothold within the city. The Ukrainians also managed to counterattack and regain some positions within the northwestern flank of Kupyansk. What we are seeing, according to my assessment, is a Ukrainian counter-offensive similar to the Ukrainian Kursk offensive in 2024, as well as their summer offensive in 2023 and their Kharkiv and Kherson offensives in 2022. I believe this to be the case due to the fact that the Ukrainians have been much more active during these past weeks than in the past 3 to 4 months combined. The Ukrainians have also relocated and rotated a lot of their forces, which have previously gone weeks, if not months, without rotation. The Ukrainians also sent a lot of reinforcements to frontline positions, ones that were in reserve being built up after their Kursk offensive last year. This means that much of the forces that the Ukrainians have been preparing for a new offensive is being used to launch counterattacks all across the front line. Whenever the Russians advance in one section of the front line, the Ukrainians counterattack to regain those positions before the Russians entrench themselves. The defensive operations that they have been launching within the Pokrovsk direction for the past half a year have now been expanded to the entire section of the front line. What does this mean for the war? Well, there are two main developments that will be taking place because of it. The first one is the fact that both sides will be taking increased casualties. The reason for this is because there are more fighting taking place, especially direct face-to-face fighting between soldiers, armored vehicles, and so on. We're seeing a lot of footage coming out of these cases taking place again for the first time since the initial stages of the Ukrainian Kursk offensive. The second part is it's unlikely that the Ukrainians will launch another Kursk offensive similar to 2024 or the summer offensive of 2023 or anything of the case. Instead, we will be seeing that the Ukrainians will be launching these counter-offensive operations all across the Donetsk region mainly, but the other sectors where the Russians are launching their own offensives as well. The objective is simply to stall the Russian offensive, slow it down, and increase the pressure on the Russians while the negotiations are taking place, and also to regain some of these positions which are necessary for the defense of the Donetsk region. If the Russians are able to capture Pokrovsk, Kupyansk, Liman, and Kupyansk, then the Ukrainians will be in a position where even if they committed these reserves to the front line, that it would be unlikely that they'll be able to defend these positions beyond these locations. Because even if the Ukrainians build new defensive lines within the Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkiv regions, the flatlands, the lack of geographical advantages, will require more forces of the Ukrainians simply to stabilize and hold the front, while the Russians will be able to strengthen their offensive operations and the number of forces attacking due to control over more logistical hubs, to spread out their forces across a wide section of the front line and larger concentrations of these forces. Therefore, the objective of the Ukrainian forces will be to stall the Russian offensive operations or stop it completely, while the Russian objective is to inflict as many casualties on the Ukrainians as possible while continuing their offensive operations to keep up the momentum before the Ukrainians are able to consolidate their positions and build new fortifications in areas where the Russians have broken through the Ukrainian defenses. If the Russians are able to continue their offensive operations despite these Ukrainian counterattacks and keep up the net positive gains that they're seeing within the Donetsk region for the past years, then the Russians will be able to defeat the Ukrainian counterattack and continue their siege over Pokrovsk, Kupyansk, Seversk, Liman, and Kupyansk, while the Ukrainians, if they're able to slow down the Russian sieges of Ukrainian cities or completely break some of these sieges, then they will be able to succeed with this counterattack and significantly delay or slow down Russian offensive operations, not just within the Donetsk region, but across the front line. Starting out in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, the Russians stormed Kupyansk, gained control over the southern and eastern parts. According to the Deep State map, they have control over the western parts, while the remaining parts is in the gray zone. Some sources have claimed full control over Kupyansk. However, according to a Russian source which has direct communication with soldiers, the Russians have control over the southern and eastern parts of the town, while the Ukrainians are contesting the western parts of it. This geolocated footage confirms Russian presence within the town as the fighting continues over it. To the north of this, the Ukrainians managed to secure Novoselivka. Ukrainian Deep State map first reported Russian presence within the town. Turns out there was approximately 4 soldiers of the Russian army within the settlement. The Ukrainians cleared them with drones and infantry counterattacking the settlement and regained control of it, and the Russians are still present within the forest lines leading into the settlement. Further to the northeast in the direction of Pokrovsk, the Russians are advancing northwest of Lysivka. The objective is to cut off the supplies going to the fortified positions in between Lysivka and Novogradka. Securing this will allow for control over a highway leading up towards Novopavlivka and along the railway leading into the eastern parts of the Shakhtarski district and the southeastern parts of Pokrovsk itself. Further to the northeastern direction of Konstantinivka, the Russian foothold gained within the city has been defeated, and they were pushed back towards Predichine, where the Ukrainians have launched their own counterattack, re-entering Predichine as well, and attempting to push the Russians out of that settlement as well, and re-establish a defensive line along the eastern fortifications east of the city. According to a Russian source who is in contact with not the unit that managed to infiltrate the city, but with adjacent units fighting in the direction of Bilaora and the Donetsk direction, the Russian soldiers who managed to gain a foothold within Konstantinivka is at best a DRG unit that launched a PR maneuver to establish themselves within the city, not to begin the siege of it or the capture of the city, but rather just to pull in Ukrainian forces to this section of the front line. Of course, this analysis could simply be some coping mechanism to justify that the Russians already lost these positions, but he's also stating that the Russians, when they manage to capture some position and nothing is heard about that position for a long while, then it's either because the Ukrainians managed to recapture it and that the Russian force was just a breakthrough force which managed to pass through Ukrainian defenses, which are actually having some offensive operation behind it. But in my personal opinion, it could also be either a miscalculated offensive where not enough forces were dedicated to the push, or as we've previously seen with the direction of Chasiv Yar, where the Russians managed to go through the Kalinina direction into the northern flank of Chasiv Yar, where a unit simply got lost and took up some positions because there simply were no Ukrainian forces present in the area. This could have been a similar case where the Russians were actually moving towards Tuposhki, but ended up driving the wrong way towards Konstantinivka and took up some positions within the trenches without any real support, getting supplied by drones and holding out for a few days, simply because there were no Ukrainian forces present within some of these trenches. Instead, what we're seeing is that the Ukrainians have now sent reinforcements and are now counterattacking here east of the city, attempting to reestablish their positions here on the outskirts of Chasiv Yar, while the Russians continue building up their forces within the city to build up for offensive operations in the stinky section of the front line here north of Konstantinivka. Further north in the direction of the Sherebets River line, the Ukrainians' counterattack within Redkotop continues as they look to push the Russians out of the town. The town is split into the northern and southern parts, the northern under Ukrainian control and the southern under Russian control. The Ukrainians have now entered into the part which was Russian since the start of the month and has been for a while. This Ukrainian counterattack has continued for quite a while as he continued pushing forces into Redkotop, and there's a lot of mainly positional fighting between the Russians and the Ukrainians within the town. The Russians and the Ukrainians are constantly launching FPV drone strikes on each other's positions, as well as artillery strikes, and the Russians also launching FAB strikes on the Ukrainian positions, where they are targeting the forces, opposing forces present within the town that is split between the Russian and Ukrainian forces, and with soldiers within the town, they're easier to spot each other, allowing for precision strikes on each other's positions. Just north of Rytkotub, the Russians managed to gain control over Hruschenkove and are expanding their offensive operations beyond the settlement in the direction of Meliivka to the northwest, and Rivka to the north, and Novomir to the northeast, where the Ukrainians recently launched some counteroffensive operations, regained control over the southern parts of Novomir and the western parts of Novomikhailivka. There's also been some fighting taking place here in the western flank of Kharkivka, leaving a large portion of it in the gray zone. The Russians are pushing towards Ulhivka as well from the southwestern direction, potentially also from the northeastern direction through Kharkivka. The Russians may be looking to encircle the Ukrainian forces, attacking in the direction of Novomir and Novomikhailivka, and push in the direction of Ulhivka and Andrivka, cutting off the supply lines for the Ukrainian forces and continuing defensive operations further north into the Kharkiv region along the Luhansk, Donetsk, Kharkiv border area. They push in the western direction towards Meliivka, also confirms Russian offensive operations in the direction of the Oskil River line itself, along the river line, as the Russians are looking to gain full control over the remaining parts of Rytkotub, Karpivka here on the western flank, and then down towards the supply lines leading into Liman from the northwestern direction. In the Kupyansk section of the front line, the Ukrainians managed to make a large counterattack, regaining significant portions of the areas here to the northwest of Kupyansk. The Ukrainian forces were geolocated to be present around the intersection here in the northwestern parts of Moskovka. This was a push from along the railway area, indicating the Ukrainian recapture of the railway to the northwest of Kupyansk. This means that the Russian main supply lines leading into Kupyansk from the northern direction comes from along the Oskil River line and Kinderashivka direction through the highway. Although the highway is contested between the Russian and Ukrainian forces due to the close Ukrainian proximity to the highway, although it is under Russian physical control all the way from the Vorishna to Kupyansk. The Ukrainians can constantly be counterattacking in the direction of the highway, which means that the main supply lines comes from roads that aren't through the highway, but along the river line instead, and in between the river line and the highway. This means that the Russian forces operating within Kupyansk have limited supplies, limiting their offensive capabilities, and this is why the Ukrainians have been able to counterattack, because they created a situation where, with the defense of the highway, allowing the Russians to pass through but attacking their supply lines allows them to weaken the offensive capabilities of the Russians and defend with a smaller amount of forces. And now with the counterattack, the Ukrainians may be looking to cut off the supplies to the Russian forces operating within Kupyansk, while the Russian objective would be to solidify their hold over the northern parts of it, as well as to counterattack in the direction of the highway to secure their hold over the highway itself, supporting the supply line leading into the town to keep their forces supplied and strengthen their positions within it. Cutting off the supplies for the Ukrainian forces will allow the Russians to gain control over Kupyansk, and pushing into and connecting their forces on both flanks of the Oskil River line to the east and west, gaining full control over Kupyansk, will allow the Russians to make significant gains east of the Oskil River line in the Kupyansk section of the front line, and this is what the Ukrainians are attempting to prevent with their counterattacks here in the Kupyansk direction. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.